421 Management. 4 activities A, B, C and D are shown in the table below. Activities A and B can be performed in parallel. However, the other activities cannot be done until their preceding activities are completed. For example, C cannot begin until B is completed. A dotted line in the diagram represents a dummy activity. Which of the following is the appropriate arrow diagram that corresponds to this table? So we have the table here, which shows activities A and B showing no preceding activities, and C and D both having a preceding activity. C requires the completion of B to proceed, and D requires the completion of both A and B. Let's have a look at the options that we have. The options are A, this diagram, B, C, and D. Note that we have differences in where D and C come with respect to dummy processes with the dotted line appearing here, 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 or here. Question is, which one of these is the correct diagram to describe these processes? An arrow diagram is a chart which represents the flow of each activity for a project on the basis of the preceding activity. Nodes, i.e. circles, are placed at both ends of each arrow, and the number is assigned to each node. In addition, the activity name is written above each arrow and the number of required days below the arrow. So we have the activity name written above each arrow and the number of required days below each arrow. A dummy activity does not represent any actual activity. This is important. Is an activity with zero path cost, used to represent a dependency between tasks. Dummy activities are a useful tool to implement when the specific logical relationship between two particular activities on an arrow diagram cannot specifically be linked or conceptualized through simple use of arrows going from one activity to another. We'll look at an example of a dummy activity on the next slide. Here, activity D is dependent on activity B only. However, because of the dummy activity, activity C is dependent on both activity A and B. The conditions have been illustrated in the following diagram. You can see how, first of all, we begin with process A and B independently occurring. Now, D is dependent on B, so it can only happen once B has been completed. But by adding this dummy process, so we have the dummy activity here, represented by the dotted line. Because of the dummy activity, C is dependent on both A and B. If the dummy was not there, it would only be dependent on A, but because there is a dummy arrow there, we are saying that it is dependent on A and B, and so it can only begin once both A and B have finished. If we now analyze the table and all options that we had in the question, for activity C, the preceding activity has to be B. Only diagrams B and C fulfill this condition. For the next condition, for activity D, preceding activity has to be A and B. Here, diagram C has a dummy activity going from the node after activity B to the node before activity D. This fulfills the condition of activity B being the preceding activity of D. Therefore, C is the appropriate arrow diagram. Just to make the point clear, if we look at each of these diagrams here, for C, which we know is the right answer, A and B are independent of anything, so they begin at the start. C is dependent on B only, as you can see here. D is dependent on A, but because of this dummy arrow, it's also dependent on B. And this fulfills the criteria given in the question, in the table. Therefore, C is the correct answer.